sat through events and talks and things today at the World Meeting of Families in the RDS, and indeed I know there are many things on there tonight as well, so I really appreciate that so many of you have taken the trouble to come here tonight. Many of you were here along with me back just before the referendum in May, when Baroness Nuala alone was addressing us on the issue that was ahead of us, and Father Bill kindly hosted us then for a pre-referendum event. I don't think any of us could have expected the referendum to have gone exactly as it has gone, and I think it's probably no exaggeration to say that many people find themselves shell-shocked after the referendum. We felt it was really important to try to bring people together to look at, I suppose perhaps to look a little bit around the campaign, to look a little bit around the pro-life movement in Ireland, and a little bit around how we dust ourselves down again and keep involved in that vital work of promoting the gospel of life and ensuring that all human life is respected and the human dignity that is so important to us, that continues to be something important, rather than feeling just defeated or that we lost and we should crawl under a rock. It's something I spoke very much with Father Bill around, the director of the Notre Dame Newman Centre for Faith and Culture here. I was delighted that he was very generously willing to host this event tonight. So there's not much reason for me to speak for much longer. You haven't come here to hear from me, so I'm going to introduce now Father Bill Daly, who is going to be the moderator for tonight's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for the idea of this panel. Thank all of you for being here. It's my pleasure to welcome you, as Michael did, to Newman's University Church, this place where we at the University of Notre Dame, my colleague Steen and I, are privileged to serve at the Notre Dame Newman Center for Faith and Reason. It was also my great privilege and pleasure, hard as the work was at times, and unsettling as the result was, during the referendum campaign, to at various points work with each of our three distinguished panelists tonight. So I look forward to hearing from them. You didn't come here to hear from me any more than from Michael, but I'm going to say just one or two things before we begin. Since we're in a church and I'm a priest and I can't resist. And both in terms of the referendum and other matters that needn't be specified, of which we're all keenly aware, the times can feel dark. And thinking about the future of the pro-life movement as we're discussing tonight can seem as though there's an urgency to it because history is coming towards an end. But you know, in St. Paul's time, in the first century of Christianity, everyone thought Jesus is coming back imminently, and you know, we're already messing things up. And for the last 2,000 years since, people have thought, well, the first 1,000 years, that was the beginning, but surely the second 1,000, that's toward the end. It's only for God to know whether the first 2,000 years of Christianity are its infancy or its elderly stages. We tend to be fixated on our own times as the most important, but it's good for us to remember that the gospel of life always has a future. Love always has a future. And for us to reflect upon our role in that future and how we can help to build that future is an exercise in people who are reminded time and again by the Lord that his kingdom grows as the mustard seed, from something very small into something very large. And that the grass grows when the farmer goes to sleep at night and he knows not how. So as we think about and in some ways try to predict the future, we do so with humility and always as a Christian people with hope. For even when things look disturbing, we remember that it is our Lord who has the words of life and is the bread of life and is the way and the truth and the life. And with that and no further ado, David Quinn, you all will recognize, especially from his column in the Irish Catholic. But beyond his column in the Irish Catholic, you might also read the Sunday Times, Ireland edition, in which he is also a columnist, and you're probably well familiar with his distinguished work as the founding director of the Iona Institute, which does so much to promote so many important issues, especially issues at the heart of this week in the World Meeting of Families. And so David has, well, I suppose between David and Maria for the least happy task. But David's unhappy task is to give us a little bit of a retrospective on the referendum itself. David.
Is this on? Okay. Hello everyone, thanks Father Will. Thanks for all coming tonight. So, I think the way we're dividing this up, we'll each speak for maybe 15 minutes, and I'm going to look back at the referendum, and Maria is going to look at the present situation and the legislation on offer, and Maria is going to look forward to the future of the pro-life movement, and plenty of time for questions and discussion, I think, is the way it is done. So, look, pick up now. Can you all hear me? Okay. The scale of the victory took us all by surprise for the other side. It was really shocking, and in fact, it even surprised the other side. They didn't think they would win by that much. If you look back on all kinds of various campaigns in recent times, Brexit, Trump, all kinds of surprising things happening in various votes. And I wonder now if people are going over their own mind when we're about to go into the ballot box, so to speak, into the voting booths. I think some people are surprised at how they voted themselves, frankly, because I met people who were kind of surprised they voted yes. And I met people who said, I was going to vote no, and then suddenly at the last minute something made me vote yes. And you just wonder what kind of group psychology was going on. But apart from the scale of the defeat, what surprised me as well was the vote was lower than against same-sex marriage, because that was 38% and this was a little over 33%. And I would have thought this was a much easier thing to argue. I know they're not directly comparable, and some people might have voted yes last time and no this time, and a few maybe vice versa. But it was surprising, because when people asked in 2015 about same-sex marriage, what's the harm, that was a harder question to answer. This time, what's the harm that it kills an unborn baby? It's very easy to answer the question, what's the harm? So how did we do worse? And that'll take a lot of unpacking going forward, so I have no magic answer, right now. And this is particularly in light of the fact that the pro-8 campaign, the pro-life campaign overall was so much bigger than the campaign in favour of traditional marriage in 2015. So much more money, so many more volunteers, more politicians on our side, and yet we did worse. So that was the most stunning part of it for me. So we're 1 in 3. And it was a complete reversal of what happened in 1983, so 35 years ago. So the 8th Amendment was carried by 2-1 and now it's defeated by 2-1. And so it was just completely flipped on its head. So I'm just going to make a kind of stab at what happened, and many of you will know these things anyway, but let's go through some of them. So if you go back to 1983, I had a look at what some of the papers were saying at the time. There was no paper in favour of the 8th Amendment. So even 35 years ago, with 2/3 of voters in favour of the 8th Amendment, there was no major media in favour of the 8th Amendment, so going all the way back. So this time we lose by 2-1, and there's people suggesting, okay, you're now a minority, you're only 1/3, you're a rump, time to drive you off the stage, none of you should ever have a platform again. But that wasn't the line in 1983. So, if you like, they lost, so to speak, by 2-1. Nobody was saying apply to platforms. On the contrary, they were given more platforms than ever in order to reverse the vote. So, what happened in a way, it was a 35-year-long campaign right from the get-go about the 8th Amendment and how awful it was and how we needed to reverse it. So, right from the get-go, there was a campaign against it. Whereas, again, this time we've been told this is the will of the people, it's locked in stone forever. So while the church must change its doctrines, pro-choice doctrine is unquestionable and must be accepted forevermore. And that's it. It is the end of the story and the end of the line for us, which of course is not one little bit. We've just got to take the long view, but Breda will deal with that. So in order to unravel the 8th Amendment, a huge concentration on the hard cases down the years, and particularly in recent years, and these are undoubted hard cases. So obviously rape is a horrible, horrible case, and extremely hard case for us to deal with on the 8th Amendment for bad abortion in cases of rape. We have the so-called fetal abnormality, which is a life-limiting condition, as we prefer to say, or this terminal illness. And we had all the personal stories around the so-called fetal abnormality. So, people saying I shouldn't have to go to England for this, that was just inhumane and cruel, and we have the UN committees saying the same thing, this would get widespread publicity. And then we get women in couples saying, well, I didn't make that choice, I decided to carry my baby to term, even though the baby was only going to live for a very short amount of time. And actually, at the end of the day, those personal stories, which were pro-life personal stories, was still actually working against us in a weird way. Because people at home are thinking, well, her choice was to go to England and your choice was to stay home. And that's great, and those two choices are equally valid, and it's all about choice. So I think that's how a lot of people are translating this in their own brains. Both sets of personal stories were actually reinforcing the pro-choice narrative. I mean, a horrible case as Sabina Hanover that happened in 2012, and the law, the Protection of Human Life During Pregnancy Act, so-called, was passed in summer 2013, and it was a game changer, because I think an awful lot of people made up their mind at that point that the aid amendment had to go, and were thinking, this kills someone. And she died because we're a Catholic country, and she couldn't be given the treatment she needed because of the aid amendment. So the aid amendment is a killer, literally. And so they decided that was it. A lot of people made up their mind, I think, at that point. And you know, you were blue in the face trying to say, well, actually, the eighth amendment was not the problem here. You know, women in England tragically die of sepsis poisoning as well, and in the States, because sometimes it's simply not spotted, or whatever the case may be. But I don't want to rehash all that. Just suffice it to say that a lot of people made up their mind at that point. And of course, we saw how some MPs and senators, you know, Lucinda Creighton, Clarence Flanagan, etc., bravely voted no to that law and were all expelled from the party. And just as an aside, I mean, that's the political version of excommunication. When you think about it, because you're expelled from your parliamentary party, you know, you're thrown outside of the political community of your own party, so to speak, and the media were all supporting that. You know, the church itself is allowed to have no discipline around anything, including, you know, the right to life itself. So people say it's okay to be Catholic and vote yes, because I just think it's appalling. So another problem is, all down the years, people are acquainted with the hard cases that argue against the Eighth Amendment, but they were simply in no way, shape or form made properly acquainted with the hard cases for the pro-choice or pro-abortion side, the kind of cases that would routinely occur in places like Britain and America. So just to go through some of them briefly: late-term abortions, so we're talking third trimester, and the so-called partial birth abortions. I shouldn't say so-called, because that's what they are. And people just completely unfamiliar with these things. Babies born alive after an abortion are left to die, which happens reasonably commonly, and people never told about this. Scandals involving abortion clinics, and these scandals could be just simply that they don't have proper health standards, that they don't get proper consent from the woman to the abortion, that doctors, because in England, as you probably know, 2 doctors are supposed to pre-sign the form before she has the abortion, and some of these forms pre-signed, and it causes, you know, no reaction here because not reported. We have the horrible examples of miscarried and aborted babies having their bodies thrown into the hospital incinerators, all right, by the thousands, and this gets no publicity whatsoever. Meanwhile, we hear all about Quinn babies, which goes back to 1961, who died naturally, but we're not hearing about these babies killed here and now deliberately, and their bodies thrown into hospital incinerators, so nobody knows about that. In the States, International Planned Parenthood, trading essentially in fetal body parts, nobody heard about that. Eugenics, so they heard a little bit about that very late in the day, which is the mass aborting of children with disabilities, particularly Down syndrome, so 90% diagnosed with Down syndrome. Countries like Britain get aborted, same in America. In Britain, in Denmark, the figure is more like 98%. In Iceland, some years it's been 100%. And the only time people get to hear about that here is when we raise it, and then we're told it's impolite to raise it. It's impolite to raise it. So in a few years' time, we wake up and there'll be hardly any of these children left because it was impolite to raise it. So we were immediately, you know, slapped down for raising eugenics and told we were impolite for calling it eugenics, which it manifestly is, because what eugenics means is well born, and so these are not considered fit to be born, and someday they won't be born, and because it was impolite to raise it. So it's just horrible. And then gender selective abortions, so in some communities more girls than boys get aborted. And then the sheer scale of abortion in all these countries. You know, one baby aborted for every 4 born in Britain, one baby aborted for every 3 born in Sweden, which is held as a model country. We're not told about that either. So we were told nothing but nothing about the realities of abortion in these other countries. So we only hear about the horrible realities of the 8th Amendment in this country. So people were just woefully misinformed during the campaign. So we were all subjected to really hard questioning. But how often did you hear Simon Harris being subjected to hard questioning? It just didn't happen. I mean, it was a press conference that Iona held during the campaign, and Marie was at it too, and the hostility of the journalists had to be seen to be believed. And there happened to be a press conference that day in the same hotel, Boswell's, by one of the pro-choice groups. And one of the journalists, who was fair-minded, he said, "Oh my God, the difference is huge between the press conference here, Iona, and the press conference next door for this pro-choice group. All soft questioning. In with us facing terror and guts out." And we have it online on our Facebook page, and again, it has to be seen to be believed. We have the church scandals, which did the most fantastic damage, obviously. And I mean, when you think about it, it's just so horrible, because those scandals, you know, child sexual abuse, and it's just very hard to contemplate, and it just made it easier to pass an abortion law. And when you think about what that involves, okay, the death of an unborn child, so the sheer irony of that, but that just did colossal damage and completely undermined the moral witness of the church, but also undermined the moral witness of lay Catholics, who had absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with any of that, but it just undermined the entire enterprise. And even though the pro-life argument can be made completely independently of religion, you still carried all this baggage into the campaign. I think as well, we have to face the fact that we are just in, and I'll finish up now in a couple of minutes, we're a massively changed culture in which the highest value is considered to be autonomy and therefore choice. And so again, some of these people who after the campaign are coming up to me, "Oh David, I don't know why I voted yes, really, I wasn't going to vote yes, but then I voted yes." And you're kind of thinking, I think I know the reason why. It's because it is a backup when contraception fails. You're not supposed to say that, but it's obviously absolutely true, because you don't want a baby, and that's why you're using contraception. And you end up, and a baby is on the way, and you don't want this. And that's why in these cultures you end up with such a high abortion rate. And so it's simply considered part of the way we live now. And some people might regard it as an evil, but might see it as a necessary evil. I know people right away in the campaign who admitted it's a baby. I know it's a baby, and I know it kills a baby, but I'm sorry, a woman's right to choose comes first. And an awful lot of people believe that. So I would say over 2/3 who voted to repeal the 8th Amendment, probably about half of them are hardcore, and half of them are thinking evil necessity. So I'm going to vote for it, and we have it anyway. Just very briefly, could we all have run the campaign better, all the various pro-life groups? I'm sure we could have, but actually looking back, I just don't see how this is winnable. I'd say on a really good day, we might have got to about 40%. But I just find it very hard to work out in my head what was the pathway to victory in this, given all the things I've just described. So, I mean, I'm going to finish on that note, but it won't be, I mean, that is a pessimistic note, obviously, but Breda will hopefully be a more optimistic version in the last part of this evening's proceedings. So, thank you.
As always, David Quinn brings the sunshine and butterflies. You know, David is an astute movie-goer and movie reviewer, and I'm always trying to get him to review movies in his column to give people a broader sense of who he is. And he says, "That's not my brand." So I can't get him to go off brand there, and he stayed on brand tonight. Thank you, David, for very insightful remarks, even those that were just pleasant to deliver. I should have mentioned as well, especially in this week of World Meeting of Families, that in addition to the more pedestrian columns that I mentioned, David is a wonderful husband and a father. Maria Steen, a wonderful wife and mother. You would also recognize from her column in the Irish Catholic. You may also know that she is a barrister and frequent spokeswoman for the Iona Institute. Marie is going to speak to us from her background as a barrister about the legal and political situation.
Thank you very much, short straw because I have been asked to speak to you tonight about the legislation. And after a long summer break, looking again at the legislation was pretty depressing. It is a little bit, being asked to look and read the legislation and describe it is a little bit like being asked to watch an execution and describe it. Someone has to think of the technicalities involved in the procedure. Somebody has to outline that procedure step by step and consider the parts to be played by the various actors, and all with the purpose of, and to the end of, directly, intentionally and deliberately killing an innocent person. So somehow making it technical and complicated puts a distance, I think, in people's minds between the act that's being done and their complicity in it. And it enables, I suppose, people who either campaigned for this or voted for it to feel a little easier in their consciences, I think, about doing wrong. I am conscious that we are gathered here tonight in the Catholic Church, and I feel I should say something about the abortion referendum and the Catholic Church. What was striking, of course, as David said about the referendum, was the number of Catholics who took part in campaigning for and who voted for this most unjust law. And what came to my mind when I was reflecting on it was a passage that has always stuck with me from Book 1 of St. Thomas More's Utopia. And if I may, I want to read it out to you because I think, as I say, it's always stayed with me, as much for the cleverness of his turn of phrase and his translators as well, as for the profundity of what he says. He says this: people who have made up their minds to rush headlong down the opposite road are never pleased with the man who calls them back and tells them they're on the wrong course. But apart from that, what did I say that could not and should not be said anywhere and everywhere? If we dismiss as out of the question and absurd everything which the perverse customs of men have made to seem unusual, we shall have to set aside most of the commandments of Christ, even in a community of Christians. Yet he forbade us to descend with them, and even ordered that what he had whispered to his disciples should be preached openly from the housetops. Most of his teachings differ more radically from the common customs of mankind than my discourse did. But preachers, like the crafty fellows they are, have found that men would rather not change their lives to conform to Christ's rule. And so, just as you suggest, they have accommodated his teaching to the way men live, as if it were a leaden yardstick. At least in that way, they can get the two things to correspond on one level or another. The only real thing they accomplish, that I can see, is to make men feel a little more secure in their consciences about doing evil. And I want to leave that there with you. I don't propose to go through the legislation step by step, but what I wish to do is just to highlight the main thrust of the legislation, to remind you what it is that our politicians celebrated that day in Dublin Castle in the name, apparently, of women's rights and emancipation from patriarchal oppression. I also want to highlight a couple of the changes that have taken place since May to the legislation, and look at what is further suggested by those in favour of repeal. There is a position paper that has been published by 4 academics. Clearly, to their mind, what is proposed doesn't go far enough. And of course, now that we have got rid of the 8th Amendment from the Constitution, there will be nothing stopping the Oireachtas acceding to their requests and suggestions in the future. Lastly, what I want to look at, which I think is probably the greatest fallout from this whole referendum, is the way in which the government proposes to ride roughshod over the matter of freedom of conscience. And I think that is very, very important, not just in relation to this law, but in relation to all our future laws. So to turn to the legislation, there are 4 grounds, if you remember, under which it will be legally permissible to obtain an abortion. The first, head 4, concerns a risk to the life or of serious harm to the health of the pregnant woman. 2 doctors may certify and have carried out an abortion before viability. Now, the definition of viability has been changed since May. So now it says, it's the point in pregnancy at which, in the reasonable opinion of a medical practitioner, the fetus is capable of survival outside the uterus without extraordinary life-sustaining measures. Now this just raises more questions than it answers. What qualifies as a risk of serious harm? There is a risk of serious harm when we walk out the door and cross the road here tonight. It's a small risk, probably though. So what measure of risk should be allowed or warrants the death of an innocent child? What is viability when left to the reasonable opinion of a medical practitioner who gets to decide whether he thinks a baby is capable of surviving outside the womb without extraordinary life-sustaining measures? What are extraordinary life-sustaining measures? There are many babies when they're born that need help to breathe, to stay warm, to feed. Will these be regarded as extraordinary life-sustaining measures? The next head is head 5, and it refers to a risk to life or health in an emergency. And what this means is that where there is a risk to the life or serious harm to the health of a woman, including mental health, an abortion may be certified and carried out by one doctor immediately. No gestational limits apply. And I hate to say we told you so, but we told you so. We were accused by those repealers in the debates that took place during the campaign of lying about this. And yet, here it is in black and white. There are no gestational limits, and indeed the Irish Times has actually acknowledged this in an article in July of this year. Head 6 deals with the so-called fetal abnormality provision. And I say so-called because it does not concern, despite all the talk about the certainty of these poor babies dying in utero, that is not what is envisaged by this particular provision. There is no certainty needed to warrant an abortion under this head. The legal requirement is that the death of the baby is likely, and as I said before, in legal terms, likelihood means on the balance of probabilities, which is a greater than 50% chance. The wording has also been changed from a condition that affects the fetus that is likely to lead to the death, either before birth or shortly after birth, to either before or within 28 days of birth. So we can see, as I said, that the stories of the certainty of babies dying in the womb are not what's envisaged here. And as we also pointed out before the referendum, there are many circumstances in which babies have a disability of some sort, who without medical attention, there would be a significant chance, and possibly greater than 50% chance of them dying. But with what are now recognised as fairly routine medical procedures and help, their lives can be sustained. But what is really amazing about all of this is the dishonesty with which its proponents seek to disguise the eugenic aspect of this proposal. I recently turned on the radio in a fit of madness, it has to be said, and this lady who was speaking was talking about the abortion scheme and how it should be broadened to allow for the abortion of children whose conditions weren't actually fatal. But But that still definitely was not the abortion of disabled children, she said. So here we have a situation where we're talking about non-fatal disability. But even still, and they're advocating this, but even still, they will not admit that this is what they seek. What level of self-delusion does one have to suffer from to argue that the abortion of babies with non-fatal disabilities is not about disabled children? The position paper that I mentioned earlier on, that is authored by Mairead Enright and Fiona de Londres and a couple of others, calls the 28-day limit in this regard problematic. They actually say the following: the legislation clearly excludes cases where the fetus's life expectancy after birth is short, a matter of months or years, but not as short as 28 days. So in other words, already they are envisaging that a child who may only survive for a few years, or maybe not just have full life expectancy, should come under this head. It should be permissible to abort the child under this head. They go on to say that the clinical guidelines should clarify that in the case of severe fetal diagnosis, whatever that means, that where it's not likely that the baby will die, but there's an independent risk of serious harm to the pregnant person's health, they now think that it is offensive to describe, first we were told it was offensive to describe a pregnant woman as a mother, but now apparently it's offensive to describe her as a woman because that is not sensitive to the trans community. So we have to call them pregnant persons now. And that one should basically be allowed to abort one's baby because of fear or because of stress at the idea of having a disabled child. So that child's rights should be set at naught. Finally, Head 7 concerns the 12-week proposal that we heard about, and that is abortion on demand up to 12 weeks. One change that has happened here is that the waiting period of 72 hours has been changed to 3 days because it's thought that the period of 72 hours might be too onerous. Presumably, this would be to allow an abortion on the 3rd day. You could really have a field day with the religious significance of that one. I finally want to just mention about conscience. I'm doing for time there. I think, as I said, it may be one of the most significant in terms of our future laws. Just to remind you, here's what they're proposing: that a doctor, nurse or midwife will be able to opt out of directly participating in an abortion, although they may not opt out of the duty to participate under Head 5, that's the emergency provision. But that freedom of conscience does not extend to other hospital workers, for instance porters or secretaries or others who might be involved in the provision of an abortion. And anyone who objects to taking part in an abortion must make arrangements to transfer the woman to someone else who will carry out an abortion. This clearly is an affront to the notion of freedom of conscience and is utterly oppressive. Why do I say that the attack on freedom of conscience is almost as significant as the principal evil end to which this legislation is directed? It's because real oppression subsists not just in performing and doing unjust acts, but in requiring others to participate in doing unjust things. It reaches its zenith in requiring the rest of us to do these unjust things against our wills. This is exactly what this legislation seeks to do. It gives the illusion of respecting the consciences of medical practitioners, but in reality refuses to allow them to say, I want nothing to do with this. And what makes it even worse is that none of this is actually necessary. None of this is necessary to facilitate women having abortions. It would be very easy to prepare a list of GPs who are perfectly willing to carry out these procedures and publish it on the internet. But ease of access isn't the point, because like in the bake the cake bigot cases in Northern Ireland and in the US, the point is to target pro-life doctors. By having activists present at their surgeries looking for an abortion in the hope that the doctor will refuse to transfer them to somebody else, refer them to somebody else. And once they refuse, the activists will report them to the authorities and try to ruin them. In none of the cake cases that have taken place and been reported on around the world, has it been realistically suggested that the couple concerned needed to go to the only Christian baker in town. The bakers were chosen specifically because they were Christian to expose them to opprobrium and financial disaster. And just like in the cake cases, where the couple simply crossed the street and obtained their wedding confectionery from another baker, once the GP refuses to refer, the activist, if she's even pregnant at all, will simply go to another GP, whom she knew from the outset would provide her with an abortion, to obtain the abortion pills or whatever she is looking for. The abortion will be carried out, and as a fringe benefit, a bigoted GP will be exposed. For a conscientious doctor, an insipid and ineffective conscience clause such as that proposed adds the threat of legal and professional sanctions to the already present threat of Twitter mob justice. The point is to punish dissent. Now, I said from the outset the negativity wouldn't get any better. I think I was good on my promise. But one thing did strike me about what Father Bill said at the outset, and that was the image of the mustard seed and the kingdom of heaven and faith. And it is, I think, because we're at an Irish Catholic event and we are here in a Catholic church, I think it is important to say that in all the debates that raged, and indeed in the position paper that's been published, there is a big play made out of Catholic medical ethics. No other denomination is singled out. And you know what? We should be proud of that. We should be proud to be dissenters against what is a really morally unjust law in all its aspects. So I would encourage you, don't let that mustard seed fall by the wayside. Encourage it, work together and let it grow so that, as we're told in the Gospel, it turns into one of the greatest shrubs. Thank you.
So David Quinn dragged us into the Coliseum and told us how we got there. Steen introduced us to the lions. And we're hoping Breda can show us the escape. Breda O'Brien. O'Brien, also recognized from her well-known column in the Irish Catholic. Some of you may have wrapped your fish in a newspaper called the Irish Times. She also writes for them. And that's just a joke. I've written for them recently, so I'm quite grateful that they gave us the space to talk about the Notre Dame Newman Center. She's also a wonderful wife and mother and a school teacher, and serves the community in so many ways, and we look forward to hearing from Breda tonight.
I really feel we're kind of, you know Matthew Arnold's poem, Dover Beach, you know the last lines of it, and we are here as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. I think I personally, and I know loads of my friends felt that really strongly, sorry, I pushed this up a little bit, and still feel it after the referendum. So, is there tunnel or is it an oncoming train? I think we have to take the long view, and that's not easy to do. We want it to go away. We want to go back to a situation where you could go to your GP and know that the woman next to you was not going to be looking to end the life of a member of the next generation. We want to be able to go to our obstetrician and not to have to find out whether she's somebody who's quite comfortable with taking the life of a member of the next generation. We want to go back to feeling that our GPs are not going to be persecuted. I mean, we're talking about people's livelihoods here. This is, this is really, really serious. So we want it to go away. But if we look, I think maybe we could, without, I have to be careful how I say this, resorting to some of the tactics of our opposition, if we can look at the fact that they had a long view, and that, we should maybe be thinking about the 35 years. My husband, Breda, and I met a very interesting woman in Austria a couple of years ago who was doing exactly that. She and a group of friends were looking at the political system, looking at the media and so on, and thinking, how do we get to where we want to go in 40 years' time? Now that's a particular mindset, but it's exactly what the other side did. So does that mean we sit back on our rear ends and do nothing? Absolutely not, it doesn't. Matthew Arnold, as a poet, as you probably know, was sentimentally attached to Christianity but didn't believe a word of it. We have a problem in our church with people who mightn't quite fit that category, but who do not believe a central teaching of our faith, which is that every life comes from God and goes to God, and it is not our right to take innocent life. So, I hugely appreciate the many people who are not people of faith who got involved in this campaign. I hugely appreciate them. But I think we all know that if every Mass-going Catholic had actually voted against this, we probably wouldn't be here. Certainly, okay, maybe we, Sunshine and Butterflies here says we still wouldn't have won it. But I think we'd have got a great deal closer. Somebody needs to do a thesis on the exit poll that was conducted. It's the most bizarre thing, the exit poll that was conducted the night of the referendum. For example, only 12% of people said they were influenced by their religious belief in voting, but 74% of people identified as Catholic. Something like 30% declared themselves to go to Mass weekly, and another 14% to go once a month. None of these figures add up if you were talking about core Catholic beliefs. So we have a massive job among our own people, and we're reaping the whirlwind of a long time of poor catechesis, poor preaching, and poor witness by lay people as well. So we need, I think we need to really look, everything that we do, that, and I say this with absolute love in my heart for all the people who have no belief, who believe this too, and I'm not wishing in any way to damage any alliances with them. I think those alliances are really, really important. But we need to actually look at what's wrong in our own community, and what can we do to build community. A community that actually transmits something, and that actually challenges people. Like I've heard the barnstorming homilies that Father Bill gives here, wonderful, erudite, well-reasoned homilies, and we need more of those. But with the best will in the world, the priests are not going to solve this for us. It's down to us. It's down to us. And I think we actually need to look at how credible we are as witnesses, and we need to, the fact is, the culture does not believe us when we say love both. They don't believe that we love both. Now, I'd love, just for one day, that everybody who is motivated by her or his faith would just withdraw their labour from all the voluntary and other areas that they're involved in, and just see where the country would be left, even still. like so many young parents dependent on Vincent de Paul, so many travelling families dependent on cross care, and so on. You know, all of those things. But we need to step up that commitment, and we need to step up that commitment very strongly. The old model doesn't work any longer. The model of where the young woman is stigmatized for becoming pregnant and may need to leave for a family and go live somewhere else. But those days are gone, thank God. You know? But the model that facilitates that, we need an actual... The stigma has transferred itself now, if you're a young person, to actually continuing with the pregnancy. There's a huge cultural thing we need to... we're not going to get, and as David pointed out quite rightly, we're not going to get any slack whatsoever from most of the mainstream media. So we need to do what? We need to do this kind of 40-year plan. Like I was involved in the National Women's Council as a foot soldier in the 1990s. And I just watched it in awe as the least democratic organisation in history, you know, spoke on behalf of women with an authoritative voice, even though they didn't represent most of the women that I knew. And then I watched those same women make their way into consultancies and into government departments and into, you know, and all you can say is fair dues to them. They were committed to what they believed in, and they were working from inside the structure. That's why our lobbying laws, by the way, don't, you know, are so weak, because what do you do if the people are actually inside the structure? You know, they're not lobbying from the outside, they're actually, you know. But anyway, that's another day's work. So we need to start looking at that. The vocation of Christians is in the world, so we need people in the professions and even, God help us, in journalism and in so many other areas that are actually committed. But they need not to be single issue, I think. I think they need to be seen to be people of compassion, to be people of a broad Christian viewpoint, and that involves, you know, loving both, being there for those who are in distress and being there and being seen to be there. And it's, you know, there's a great Christian tradition of, you know, not letting the left hand know what the right hand is doing when giving a charity. But in a sense, we need to build up credibility. We need to actually, you know, come out and encourage people to come out. Like lots of people who are involved in charities are actually people who are also anti-abortion and pro-life, but they are afraid. They're afraid. And those of you who've heard me speak before know that I'm obsessed with a book called The Spiral of Silence, which was written in the 1960s in Germany, and was looking at why would some people not say they were voting for particular political parties. And she realised we're social beings, and therefore if we feel that our opinion is not going to be popular, we go quiet. And then what happens is that you're sitting side by side with somebody and you do not know that they feel the same way as you do. And then after a generation or two, fewer and fewer people. So you need to break the spiral of silence. Yeah. You need to actually, and you need to do it in a way that's intelligent, that's courteous. None of these are values that are greatly, you know, liked in our, but you need to do it. You need to do it in that way. We need to break the spiral of silence around that. And we need to do that in small ways, whether it's by wearing a badge that, we are the 1 in 3 badge. I don't know if you've seen those, or something similar, so that, we haven't gone away, It's really important. People need to wear symbols. They need to speak to people. I had a crazy situation. Like, everybody knows what I feel about abortion in my staff room and everywhere else. But I discovered that I had a former colleague who was just as passionately pro-life as I was, and I never knew it. So that's the spiral of silence. I discovered it when I discovered her walking her legs into stumps during the referendum on our side of the fence. I didn't know it. So that's the typical kind of spiral of silence thing, and that's the kind of thing we need to actually break. In terms of the media, whatever you think about Jordan Peterson, the Canadian academic and psychologist who is a phenomenon, is a phenomenon. Whatever you think about him, what I personally think about him is, yes, absolutely full of sunshine. He and David should get together. But his message is very somber, and for me it's a message without the light of grace in a way, because it's all about get your act together, and you know, but it's something that young men in particular are responding to. But he is a phenomenon because of the internet. You know, because he started putting his lectures up online, and because he started, you know, dealing directly, bypassing mainstream media. Like they were talking recently about his book, saying, how did he ever get to sell all those books, seeing as he wasn't on any of the popular shows that sell books in America. And it's because of kind of word of mouth. And so we dipped our toe in the water in this referendum in that area, and some people are very talented at it, and other people need to discover their talents in it, but it is definitely an area that needs to be developed. And that's an area where young people are really going to be to the fore, because they understand it and they speak the language. And my young, if you, it's what's that awful? Sorry. Okay. What's that interesting website? Oh, what a complete ashling or something like that. What's it called? You probably, anyway, if you don't know what it is, you're not a certain age, but they come out as a book choice.
That's the title, and it's also a book.
It's also a book, yeah. So that became a community where people reinforced each other. We need secular versions of that have the same kind of credibility. And it can be done. The thing about culture is that culture changes. Yeah. We're reeling from the way it has changed with incredible rapidity. But in a way, the volatility of the current culture is actually on our side. Because things change overnight. But so, you know, they can also change back. So I also think we need to do some serious kind of rebranding in terms of our image, not just so that people will believe us. You see, we do love both. We do care about mother and father and baby. We absolutely do. Like, I remember many moons ago going from a pro-life rally to a rally which was organised about a situation in East Timor, and the overlap was striking. Do you know what I mean? The same people were at the rally, but the media would never believe that. They would never believe that. You know, we were only interested in one thing. We were only interested up until they're born. But there's an American organisation called Rehumanize International, and the rehumanize is to make the baby human in people's eyes again. So they do things like they go onto college campuses and they look at the dehumanizing languages. For example, there was yellow peril as an example, which was used about the Japanese during the Second World War as an excuse to intern them and take away their human rights. You know, and then all the other kind of terms. And then fetus is in there in the middle. You know, and what does that do? It dehumanizes. So they look at that, and they have a very consistent ethic kind of view. They're against their mission statements, and we work to ensure that each and every human being every human being life is respected, valued, and protected. As such, we oppose all forms of aggressive violence, including but not limited to abortion, unjust war, capital punishment, euthanasia, torture, embryonic stem cell research, assisted suicide, abuse, human trafficking, and police brutality. Now, people say you can't spread yourself that thin, but in fact, if you're not interested in a wide spectrum, like one of the things that's shown at the pro-life movement in America all the time is, you know, you're pro-capital punishment, but you're not, you know, you're anti-abortion, and those two seem to be like kind of tied together. And that is not, it's not a Catholic viewpoint in terms of course, there's a prudential judgment about capital punishment, and people, you know, can have different viewpoints on it. But it's just gun control, perhaps, might be a better example to take, you know. But so in terms, so to sum up then, briefly, we need to look to our own first and see what we can do and how we can, with those painful one-to-one conversations in love, talk to our own community. We need to develop our credibility in terms of practical action, things like Hugh's House, which is a house for people whose babies are in hospital with long-term illnesses, you know, all those kind of things. We need to be seen to be there and to be doing them. We are doing them, we need to be seen to be doing them. We need to take the long view. We need to get involved in political parties, but not get married to any of them, because they will let us down. That's just a fact. Casual flames with political parties. And we need to break the spiral of of silence. And I began with the grim and depressing Matthew Arnold, but I'm going to end with Catherine of Siena. Preach the truth as if you had a million voices. It is silence that kills the world. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Before we open up the floor for questions, do any of you have anything you'd like to comment in response to one another or a question for each other?
Just a quick comment. As Maria was doing her piece, I was just filled with such horror. I mean, when you actually, I'm familiar with this legislation, when you actually see things like the thing about the no extraordinary means, does that mean if a baby can't survive without an incubator, that baby is, like, how many babies do we know and love that spend time in incubators? Is that an extraordinary means? Like, how have we become this savage? But, sorry, that's definitely not sunshine and butterflies, but it was just my reaction to it. And I think we need to talk about that to people as well. We need to be saying, do you realise? Because of the people that Dave was talking about, you know, people said, well, I kind of got in there and I voted yes, and I'm not really sure why. You know, this is what you voted for. Are you going to ring your TD and say, I'm thrilled with this, or would you consider emailing your TD and saying, I'm appalled, I didn't vote for this? You know, and these are the yes voters I'm talking about, that iffy kind of people who felt they were won over by the pro-choice, compassionate thing. I mean, it is really appalling stuff.
Yeah. If I can just say that the horror of kind of modern liberal societies which place so much store by autonomy is the idea of the unchosen burden. So I didn't choose to be pregnant, that's an unchosen burden, that must be allowed to set aside, and the Church of illness because it's getting in the way of my choice. Alright? Another one is, I mean, the man says, well, you're having a baby, but I don't want you to have the baby, so I don't have to stand by you. So I'm taking off, and that's his choice, because he regards the baby as an unchosen burden, and again, his autonomy has to be respected, so his autonomy to take off has to be respected. And then, of course, at the other end of life, the unchosen burden, you might decide your illness is the unchosen burden, and therefore you have a right to end your own life, or you have a right to kind of pressure actually your parent. Isn't it really better now that for your own sake that you shuffle off your mortal coil and accept the injection, because we see this happening in places like Belgium and Netherlands and Canada and other euthanizing children in Belgium. So this great horror of the unchosen burden, you see, the trouble is, and this is what we're going to make clear to society, I think it's what will become clear to society over time, someday you will be the unchosen burden. This is the problem. Okay, so that's great, I can set aside that burden, and therefore make myself happier. That's going to be you someday. You'll be somebody else's unchosen burden. What does Christianity do? Christianity says that sometimes you must take up your unchosen burden, which of course is our cross at various times in our life. And if people are not willing to do that, if everybody is allowed to cast aside their unchosen burden, including you, we become an incredibly inhumane society, curiously in the name of tolerance. Because we're saying that the tolerant society lets people make whatever choice they like, and as I say, the horror is the unchosen burden, which you're allowed to kill. That becomes an incredibly inhumane society, in the name of tolerance and choice. So I think over time that becomes clear to people, and as Breda was saying, no social and moral consensus lasts forever. I mean, the pro-life one lasted 35 years and then gets completely reversed. So this will not last forever. There's no social consensus, no moral consensus lasts forever. And if eventually every society begins to see its own defects, then begins to say, how did we ever believe that? On that day will come.
I have one question. I'm a lawyer, some of you may know, in the United States, we have certain tethers, a law for the Religious Freedom Restoration Act in particular, that, for instance, Christian bakers may avail themselves of to try to challenge certain aspects of our law. Is there anything in the Irish Constitution or statutory law that gives doctors, for instance, a chance to fight in the courts for conscience protections, or does it all just come down to what's provided for in the legislation?
You know, there is freedom of conscience and religion recognised in the Constitution, but what's interesting actually is that the position paper that I referred to by the four legal academics, they recognise that freedom of conscience and freedom of religion exists. But what they say, and they would be people who would otherwise, I think, hold themselves out as being proponents and defenders of civil rights and human rights. But what they say is that where there is a conflict between the doctor's rights and a woman or a pregnant person who is looking for an abortion and their rights, they argue that the balance should tip in favour of the pregnant woman. And I suppose that's all to pay for. We don't know. We're in a situation where I guess it's going to be tested over the next few years. And the same women, those nice ladies, have suggested that that doctors should, in effect, pro-life doctors should, in effect, be blacklisted. That if they refuse to perform an abortion, they should put it in writing to their patient. Presumably, this is to create a paper trail by which they can then be followed. They also suggest that they should have to inform the Department of Health in advance. Again, this looks very like the creation of a blacklist. And then furthermore, they exhort the Medical Council to provide guidelines as to how to discipline doctors who refuse to refer women in these circumstances. So they clearly have become emboldened in the last 3 months. And this is just, over the summer vacation. What they will be saying in 6 months' time, a year's time, and certainly the complexion that we have in the Oireachtas at the moment, with so few TDs and senators willing to stand up. So initially we had difficulty with people changing sides kind of midstream during the debate. But now, since the referendum has been passed, the politicians who voted no, came out and voted no, are now saying they will vote to legislate. And so it seems, I can't see that the Oireachtas will defend the rights. It doesn't look that way to me unless a miracle happens. So we're in a very difficult, and I suppose we're in uncharted waters, I suppose. So it's,
So all the panelists will be sticking around. We will take a couple of questions now from the floor. The briefer your question, the more we can get in. So, right here.
Father, may I congratulate the 3 panellists. Thanks very much, very interesting information. But none of you, including you, Father, have meant that it's the Catholic Church that have been absent in that debate. They should have stood up and been counted. And that is, it takes a lot of courage to stand up and, you lose friends. People call you a bigot, a homophobe. It takes a lot of courage, and that's the Catholic Church would be too meek. If they'd given a proper lead, people had more confidence to vote no. That's my opinion.
Here. I must address that quickly. I mean, there were some bishops issued statements.
Some.
Oh,
but
sorry,
some is not enough.
No, I was just going to...
We've been waiting in agony for strong meat.
And we didn't get that repeat question. So the Catholic Church has done more. What's the essence of it? And if it had done more, we'd be in better shape. Some bishops, all bishops release statements of some kind. I'm not sure how to pick up they got, to be honest. Some priests in their own parishes did good work, but an awful lot of priests did very next to over in their parishes. And there hasn't been consistent catechesis on this anyway. I mean, you can go from one end of the year to the other and never hear a thing about the right to life whatsoever. I hear people sometimes criticising Pope Francis, but actually Pope Francis, when you actually look at what he says about abortion, it's very strong. He sometimes compares the abortion industry to the mafia, for example. But we very rarely hear that kind of talk here. And so that has been a problem. There's no question about that. So a third of Catholics who go to Mass every week end up voting yes. So the lack of consistent catechesis in parishes definitely a big problem.
Could I just ask a question there? How would a Catholic hospital, would a Catholic ethos bear out in this abortion?
The question is about how a Catholic hospital with a Catholic ethos will have to respond to this.
Well, we're told that there will be no institutional conscientious objection or freedom of conscience, that freedom of conscience belongs only to individuals, and so that it won't be open to institutions, to hospitals, to have basically a pro-life policy. That seems to be the government's stated position. There's nothing in the Act proposed in the heads of the bill to propose that would suggest that a hospital could take such a stance. And again, you know, certainly repeal proponents would, I think, object vigorously to the idea, particularly of state-funded hospitals, notwithstanding that they have a Catholic ethos and whose boards are run by religious or priests and bishops and so on, that they would not be protected. And the fact of the matter is, a Catholic hospital cannot, in conscience, carry out abortions. My own view, for what it's worth, is that if the state is going to proceed in a way that it says, that I think the bishops of Ireland should be getting out of healthcare altogether and out of education, and say to the state, make us an offer for basically the care and sites and buildings that we've been providing to the state free gratis since the inception of the state, and then set up proper Catholic hospitals our position in Iona, that there should be state-funded denominational education and healthcare. But the way things are going at the moment, I don't think this is really a functioning democracy in that sense, because the ethos, the religious ethos, is not being respected, and there certainly is a move afoot to completely wipe that out. And so I think that in fairness, as the man who commented earlier, in fairness to the lay faithful, the bishops, I think, have a duty to stand by the lay faithful who are trying their best to live a Christian life in what is very difficult circumstances and often very lonely, often a very lonely place where, as you pointed out, you are derided for your beliefs and called all kinds of names. And we need good shepherds to protect us and mind us, and basically provide forums for us, whether it be schools to send our children to, or hospitals where we don't have to, as Breda says, worry about whether the doctor looking after us, would be happy to kill somebody else's baby. I mean, that thought. I gave birth to my 4 children not far from here in Holles Street, and the idea that, of having to give birth on a table where hours before somebody else's baby might have been killed, that you bring your baby into the world in that way, just fills me with horror and sadness. That the scanning machines in the hospital that are dating the age of my baby might be used to diagnose something in another child that would be the cause of their death. I don't think a Catholic conscience cannot allow that, and so I think we have to. There's no doubt but that many priests and bishops are afraid, and as the lay faithful, we have to encourage them and build up their confidence and let them know we're behind them and we will support them, but we need their help and support too.
How much the lay faithful did, especially those who were coming and praying here at this church, because they really poured their hearts and souls into the fight for the unborn. One last question, and then we'll all have a chance to chat in the back.
In light of the fact that we know now that 80% of the young people, almost 80% of the 18 to 24-year-olds were the ones who were voting for choice. And how do we get to educate the generations that are going to vote in the future? And my experience has been, I've been out on the streets with everybody else, I've been pouring my money into the pro-life organisation, And a month before, at the beginning of May, my sister-in-law in England asked me if she could come and stay with me because she's been part of SPOC in England, and then she got involved in the CBR, which is the Centre for Bioethical Education. And she came to stay with me for a week to join the group that we're here, that's been set up by Dr. Jean Ingalls. And this small group of one man and a small team of 8 to 10 people hit more headlines, had more conversations, and educated more people. And I really feel very strongly that the resources that we had spent in trying to reach people, and what I've seen, how effective I've seen their lobbying or their stand, and how it really rattled Simon Harris insofar all of the materials have been confiscated illegally by the police in Middleton and Cork, and they have been, since the beginning of June, with their council trying to get their materials back, and they've been blocked. The guards have, everywhere they went, the guards have hassled them, and
well, thank you, and we'll let the panel talk. The thrust of the question was, thank you very much for the anecdote as well.
I was just saddened that
the
the pro-life group actually came out, the spokesperson actually came out and criticised them and, didn't support them in any way, but publicly criticised them.
Because we need to come to an end with this, but people laughed at me and thought I was joking, but I was 100% serious when I think that when I said, 87% of, 18 to 24 voted yes. We need to find the 13%. I think Michael Kelly worked it out, was it 36,000 or something? They are the best people in Ireland. They managed to stand up. To stand up to the intimidation, the peer pressure, the relentless propaganda. Every time that they went onto Facebook, every time they looked at their Instagram account and so on. And in spite of all of that, they managed to stick to the truth. So that's where we're going to start, with those people, because they are the influencers, because they are what my obsession, Elizabeth Neumann in her Spiral of Silence book calls the hardcore, the people who actually, so we're going to start there. We'll have to agree to disagree on the Centre for Bioethical Research. I actually think they helped to lose the referendum, and I'm sorry if that's hurtful to you, but that's my personal opinion. I think they alienated a lot of people because of their graphic imagery and so on.
True.
But I think, we're not going to fall out over that. We need to stick together and to work together. But it's, but in terms of where we start with education, unfortunately, Maria is right. We cannot rely on the school system. The school system is undermined from within. There are great schools, but they're a minority. So what we need to do is we need to go back to building community. One of the awful byproducts of the scandals was that churches became afraid to work with young people. But I see really hopeful signs in that. I see churches yet again tentatively putting their toe into the water of dealing with 12 to 16-year-olds and 16, 17-year-olds, starting up groups, starting up whatever. All of that is absolutely vital. It's absolutely vital. Let us not discount that 13%. They're our hope for the future.